Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Lardner from the Marxist Education Project, and we are, again, very appreciative of all the work that Greg and Colin did in putting together this year's Socialist Register, which new polarizations, old contradictions, the crisis of centrism. We have with us today, besides Greg, the editor, three featured authors who have put together works that are collected today in the panel title of The Hard Right and the Political Parties of Capital. It's enough from me. Greg, the Zoom room floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks, Michael. This is really a thrill for me to introduce these three people today. They're all friends and comrades for a long time, and so I'm kind of really pleased to be able to introduce the discussion today, picking up on one of the themes on the radical right and the political party system. One of the themes of this year's volume of the Socialist Register on new polarizations, old contradictions. Began editing this year with Leo Panich and had commissioned much of the essays before he died, as we were just beginning kind of to finish up and begin responding to a few of the essays. And I was lucky that Colin Lees, another old friend and comrade going back to his days of living in Canada, was able to take it up, and he was a close collaborator with Leo on some of Leo's most important books, as well as being a former co-editor of the Register. So I was fortunate enough to lost Leo's big arms grabbing me and holding me up, and managed to kind of have Colin catch me. When we were conceiving the volume, we had kind of thought of it as thinking through a decade or so of developments, essentially from the great financial crisis to the pandemic crisis, a decade that defined a certain kind of conjuncture that had been marked not only by the failure of the working classes to develop and organize the response to the financial crisis, the way neoliberalism had returned, the way that the state had continued to reorganize itself, the way the right had kind of claimed a range of the political space that had been opened up by the crisis, to think about these developments in a longer term perspective. The word polarization was being discussed everywhere, invoked as it is still daily. And obviously current events are always raising issues of the new polarizations and some of the particularities of the form. We wanted to insist that they were also part of older contradictions within capitalism, kinds of contradictions that Marx had and others had raised going back to the mid-19th century on some of the characteristic class contradictions and polarizations that are internal to capitalism, and asking that the way that they're still found in current contradictions. The polarizations that are everywhere are so characteristic of that in terms of income and wealth. The communications polarizations today, particularly around the social media, in work conditions, and what is characteristic of this period, but some of Marx's great writings were, of course, on the political polarizations of the right in different kind of conjunctures. And this last decade has been also about the polarizations coming from the hard right movements as they've occupied political space, often even in government, certainly gaining some electoral space, and dominating a range of street politics and demonstrations over the last period. And clearly in the events of today that we're all kind of debating and trying to figure out an aspect of militarization that will further raise the dangers of political polarization, not only on the kind of the geopolitics of it all, but also the increased military spending, but also that military spending was already raising a new level of arms development in terms of the hypersonic ballistic missiles systems and upgrading of the nuclear weapons of the main powers. And so that was the theme that we wanted to take on. One of these themes inevitably had to take on the question of the crisis of centrism, which we had been writing about. You could kind of say, going back even to Leo's classical essay in 1985 on the impasse of social democracy, the evacuation of the political center as a foundational kind of thesis that we've been hammering at in terms of the Socialist Register for a long time. We had picked it up again in the 2016 volume on the politics of the right, which we attempted a global map of the forms of the new right taking hold in different parts of the world that wasn't limited to the European North American space, but was finding multiple forms around the world. And so one of the kind of themes that we wanted to make sure was in this volume. And we were fortunate that the three names that Leo and I kind of started tossing around right away were Ingar, Bill, and Samir. And so we were very lucky that they both agreed to contribute to the volume and lend their expertise not only as writers, but all three of them are significant public intellectuals in their home countries, and so are playing a presence in day-to-day political activism and political and on the left, but also in general in terms of assessing for the general public the developments on the right. So it's just great that we're able to have them. Ingar Solty, who will kick it off, is a senior research fellow in foreign peace and security policy at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Berlin. Some of his recent books are on imperialism, the US under Obama, out in Germany, and the first with some of our great German colleagues that we've had in the pages of the Socialist Register that Ingar has written with and studied with. His essay in this volume is Market Polarization versus Political Polarization, Liberal Democracy's Eroding Center. And we'll kick it off with Ingar. Go ahead, Ingar.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for this lovely introduction. And also thank you for organizing this, Michael, and to the Marxist Education Project. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss all the three chapters together with all of you great comrades. So I'll start with the general theme of the essay, and in my concluding remarks, I will try to link it up to a certain extent to most recent events and what they might entail with regards to the crisis of centrism. Altogether, I mean, like outside of the Socialist Register and like some other small leftist circles in the 1990s, most were intellectuals from the center were convinced that, including social democracy, Anthony Giddens, etc., were convinced that like liberal market economics, i.e. the liberalization of trade, privatization of public assets, and the deregulation of labor markets, financial markets, etc., was the path, like was the way to go to achieve economic stability and prosperity, to unleash the forces of technological innovation, to lead to economic efficiency, and also politically to lead to democratization, to stable liberal parliamentarian systems, multi-party systems. Of course, today, when we look back at those promises of the 1990s, or like those faith or belief systems of the 1990s, quite the opposite became true. We instead of arriving at prosperity and economic stability, we have record level wealth inequality, which of course is a problem for democracy, as most political or many political theorists, starting from the American constitutional process, have warned us. We're dealing with vast geographic divergencies as a result of neoliberal economic policies, not only between the global north and the global south, but also within economic macro regions like the European, like the Eurozone, with like a functioning core in the north and like an internal periphery, especially in the south, but also in the east. Vast geographical divergencies also within like core capitalist countries, where they are in the US, but also like from, you know, like functioning cores like the Research Triangle, Silicon Valley, or the greater metropolitan area in New York, as opposed to the Rust Belt. Similarly, you could describe it for like Germany with the south and the southwest, being the functioning core, and like the northeast, like especially the east, but also parts of the northwest being like an internal periphery. And even in like cities like Berlin or Paris or London, where you have like highly class apartheid living situations where like the classes don't intermingle, and where the poor are being pushed to the margins of metropolitan areas, the poor that keep running those cities. So vast geographic divergencies. Also, we see that like the so-called efficiency of the market, of course, is not social efficiency. As I point out in the essay as well, we have an externalization of cost, especially to the environment, but also to the future, which can lead us to the acknowledgement that the climate catastrophe is actually the biggest market failure in the history of capitalist society. And also the issue that as opposed to the notion that unleashing the forces of the market would lead to technological innovation, like when we criticize that ideology and like go into the history of technological innovation, digitalization, we find that most of that innovation came actually out of the public spheres through public investment, not the least in the arms industry. And economic stability actually, like the promise of economic instability gave way to economic instability from the like the ever escalating financial and economic crises from New York in '87, Mexico in '94, '95, the Asia crisis in '97, '98, Russia in '98, '99, the dot-com bubble when it burst in 2000, 2001, to the global financial crisis and the corona bioeconomic pandemic. Needless to say that this kind of economic polarization of societies and of the planet had to have repercussions vis-a-vis the political system. And we can see that in the fact that you can't, essentially, you cannot have market polarization without also ending up with political polarization. This political polarization has a different outcome across the political landscape, across electoral systems, like in proportional representation systems, like in continental Europe. It mostly played out in a kind of Italianization of party systems. So in essence, like 3-party systems turned into 6-party, 7-party systems. Big parties that like had historically characterized the post-war era suddenly collapsed and were replaced by one individual kind of campaigns, like say the Austrian Conservative Party that was replaced by the Sebastian Kurz campaign, or in France, how Macron essentially created a platform around himself. So like an Italianization of proportional representation party systems, but at the same time also against the notion of like against the appearance of stability in 2-party systems like in the US or like in the UK, an actual inner erosion of those party systems where grassroots revolts from both the left and the right were seriously threatening the hegemony of like the centers, the part like the traditional elites in those parties, from the Bernie Sanders campaign to the Donald Trump campaign, with the far right being more effective and better in actually seizing power in those parties against the will of the traditional party elites in those parties that are connected, of course, to economic forces, namely transnationalized capitalist forces, like the dominant capital factions in the power bloc. So we saw that rise of right-wing authoritarian nationalism, especially in the wake of the global financial crisis, from Hungary to Poland to Austria, Italy, Brazil, the Philippines, India, and Australia. The rise of charismatic leaders that existed during the neoliberal era. I mean, we talked about Berlusconism, we talked about Sarkozyism, but like a strong trend now towards Caesarist politicians and a declining faith in the problem-solving capacities of liberal parliamentarianism. And those problems, of course, loom large. I mean, I would say that we are amidst a 6-dimensional crisis not only of the economy and accumulation, but also a crisis of social reproduction, which is expressed by the fact that we have had a feminization of the labor market but under neoliberal conditions, which essentially feminized the low wage or created a low wage sector largely dominated by women and especially women of color. Like a crisis, thirdly, of social cohesion, namely that the neoliberal welfare reforms, the transition from a welfare state to a workfare state, the flexibilization of labor markets in combination with a capital-driven digitalization process or digitization of the economy essentially creates drastic insecurities in the subjectivities of the working class, when essentially it means that not only as like a traditional worker, but also like as a professional worker, say you're a translator or a doctor or a lawyer, you cannot necessarily tell whether your job is still going to be there 10 years down the road, which of course under conditions of a neoliberalized welfare state means that you like social exclusion is very close at hand and drives fear deep into the even professional labor force. Then a fourth level of crises, namely the crisis of liberal democracies, which I talked about earlier and which I will go into further detail now. And fifthly, a crisis of world order described roughly by the relative decline of US hegemonic power and the rise of China, the US-China high-tech rivalry and everything it entails. And sixthly, a crisis of ecological sustainability and the impending climate catastrophe or ongoing climate catastrophe. So in a situation like that, you would expect political parties to essentially develop a vision of how to, a bold vision of how to deal with all those crisis levels at the same time, to essentially lead their societies out of those transformational crises. However, when we actually look at how political parties operate in the liberal parliamentarian systems, we find that they are largely unable to plan for the future. That we see like the Italianization of party systems, especially in continental Europe, leads to a kind of particularization of parties, where they're essentially just oriented towards the next election, just oriented towards regaining some of their popularity, regaining some of their seats. And of course, that means like when you have a multi-level civilizational crisis as described before, but political parties that are not apt to or not even addressing those crises with big visionary plans, it means that not only dystopias rule in the common sense, like in our popular culture, but utopia itself or any kind of vision of a better tomorrow is shifted towards private actors in the Silicon Valley, like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, transhumanism, and all those kinds of things. But the particularization of political parties has a lot to do with market polarization. Because as Jürgen Habermas as well as Nikos Poulantzas described in the 1970s, the problem is that when you have a big societal crisis, you need strong statecraft, you need strong political parties that are capable of developing political projects to deal with those multi-level crises. But the paradox is that those crises Italianize the political system. So in the very same moment that you need strong parties in liberal parliamentarian systems to find solutions to social problems, those parties become weaker and weaker and are therefore not up to the task. As you can see, I want to just give you one example, like how that particularization plays out with the example of Germany, where essentially you have post-war cross or catch-all parties like the Christian Democrats and the Christian conservatives. They've been running the country for essentially the entire time, with like very few years when Social Democrats were in power and like where there was a Social Democratic chancellor. You would expect them, to be able to fulfill a leading role, but that's not what is happening. And it has to do with the fact that in a polarized society, you cannot no longer exist as a catch-all party. Like the CDU, for instance, is being torn apart as a bourgeois party, is being torn apart on the one hand by a transnationalized, modern, young urban bourgeoisie and also a labor force adapted to a global capitalist economy. And then on the other hand, like which is represented by the Green Party, and on the other hand, like a right-wing populist party like the AfD, which is catering to like more domestic, more rural, non-academic, older labor force, and like a domestically oriented bourgeoisie not adapted to global capitalism. As a CDU or a strategist, you're essentially in like in a situation that you cannot solve, because shifting more towards the Green Party will force you to lose more votes to the right, to shed votes to the AfD. And if you shift towards right-wing populism, you will lose votes to the Green Party. And that's what is creating those problems as a result of political polarization. In my essay, I'm arguing that right-wing authoritarian nationalism is a powerful, or is like a friction of or a fallout of market polarization in neoliberalism, and that it's like a force in itself, but that it essentially is a revolt, like a blind revolt of the middle classes. That it is essentially oriented or like driven by those segments of society who are meritocratically oriented towards the bourgeoisie and like oriented towards like a market conforming lifestyle, and who in those crises, especially like the digitization, that this crisis of social cohesion that I mentioned, are fearing downward mobility and are therefore appealing to a Bonapartist leader and the nation to lead them out of this crisis. The nation as understood as a kind of collective narcissism in Adorno's language. So they're appealing to a powerful Caesarist leader to protect them from the mercilessness of the market. In that sense, however, the right-wing authoritarian nationalism is only is a fallout of market polarization, but it's only fighting the symptoms, not the root causes of market polarization. For instance, it is against migrants, but it's not against the kind of free trade that is producing the racialized and ethnicized conflicts that are leading to state failure and leading to the displacement of people. They are against crime and like oriented towards zero tolerance policies, catering to fear of crime, but they're not against the kind of wealth inequality that we know is breeding crime and is resilienizing societies. They're against, or they're exposing toxic masculinity, but they're not against the crisis of social reproduction, which is essentially undermining masculinity and is the root cause also of the gender conflicts over the division of reproductive labor, etc. So it is a blind revolt, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous. I would argue, or I argue in the essay, and now I'm coming to the conclusion, that right-wing populism or right-wing authoritarian nationalism, as I would prefer calling it, is dysfunctional in a global capitalist system where the transnationalized bourgeoisie is essentially the dominant force, where transnational capital is essentially the dominant capital faction in the power blocks in the core capitalist countries. However, with the situation of both the pandemic and now Putin's war in Russia, this may be, may have to be problematized, because we saw that essentially the US-China conflict, like China came out hyper competitive out of the global financial crisis, like the austerity path of the West was not as competitive as that strong state interventionism of China. And the West was at a fork in the road where it essentially had to decide whether to use all military and non-military force to essentially force China into submission to like a neoliberal Western economic system, or to emulate China and its state interventionism to essentially beat China with its own weapons. We saw with the pandemic, like overdetermined by the pandemic, that and even prior to that, a return to industrial policy, and also especially in the European Union, like a symbiosis between industrial policy and militarization, like in PESCO and the European Defense Fund, and etc. And so the question is, if we are being, through Putin's war, that is my hypothesis, we are being pushed into new block confrontation with supply chain, like countries that are lined up through supply chains, through military pacts and proxy wars at the outer rims of those blocks. And under those circumstances, right-wing authoritarian nationalism could actually become turn from a friction into like a politically adaptable and useful force in that block confrontation. I mean, the AfD, for instance, was completely not acceptable for the Bosch and Siemens and BMW and Mercedes, etc., as long as they were against NATO and against the euro. But it seems that now, with the re-strengthening of NATO, with like the new bloc confrontation, this kind of nationalism might actually play a big role in like a renationalization of politics. And that, of course, spells out like quite dangerous when it comes to liberal values or like any kind of democratic values in Western societies. And because it would now, I think it enables potential coalitions between right-wing populist forces and traditional conservative forces. That, of course, is a very dangerous development, and hopefully we can discuss that when we're having the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingar, for that informative presentation and warnings, and bringing us right up to date. The second speaker up will be Bill Fletcher, a writer, novelist, trade unionist, solidarity activist. One of his most important books on the U.S. labor movement, Solidarity Divided. His essay in the current volume is on the rattle or the tail of the rattlesnake, Trump and the dangers of right-wing populism in the U.S. A remarkable appraisal of the forces marshaling on the right in the U.S. and the particular forms of authoritarian nationalism in the U.S. So kind of bouncing off a theme that's also in Ingar's essay. Bill, of course, wrote a remarkable essay for us in the Socialist Register 2016, which was incredibly prescient on reading Trump and the impact that Trumpism might have on American politics. It remains a signal contribution of thinking through what the forms of the far right might take place in the U.S. So, Bill, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Michael. Real pleasure. I appreciate this discussion, and it's interesting. As recently as 2015, it was very difficult to have a discussion in much of the left about right-wing populism and neo-fascism, and that when this was raised, all too often, people on the left would say, you're exaggerating the problem. This is an effort to move us away from talking about the centrist neoliberal forces. This is really not what we should be focusing on. And then Trump was elected. And even then, in the United States, there were forces that will go nameless that continued to insist that the danger from right-wing populism and neo-fascism was exaggerated. In fact, immediately after the January 6th coup attempt, there were those that said, okay, the right has been defeated. Now we can go back to attacking centrist Democrats. At which point I was wondering what dimensional plane they existed on. So I'm really happy to have this discussion. And Ingar and I are in agreement on much of what he laid out. I use the term right-wing populism as opposed to right-wing nationalism, because I think what we're up against is more than nationalism, more than right-wing nationalism. We're up against forces that are incredibly misogynist, incredibly male supremacist, and it's central to their politics. Whether you're looking at forces as extreme as Al-Qaeda and Daesh, or if you're looking at the pro-Trump forces in the United States, male supremacy is very, very central to their notion. And I think in looking at this in terms of right-wing populism, we're looking at what I call the herpes of capitalism. It's the virus that runs through the system, and that it surfaces at various moments when the larger system is weak. And it has different manifestations in various countries. And I think that it's really important that when we're looking at right-wing populism and neo-fascism being a subset of right-wing populism, that we understand the nationally specific form that it takes, that it's not going to look identical in France and Netherlands or the United States or Iraq, but that there are certain things that it has in common. And so the article that I wrote in the Socialist Register was in many ways a sequel to the piece that I wrote in 2016 or for the 2016 Socialist Register that Greg mentioned. So a few points. I have 7 points that I want to cover. One is the first, again, that right-wing populism is a virus that's inherent in capitalism. It's not something that is unique at any point. It recurs, but does take different forms. That it tends to be rooted in the middle strata, which is a point that is incredibly important when we're doing a class analysis of this, and getting away from this notion that right-wing populism is a phenomena among workers. Not that there isn't a working class element of it, but that it is largely something among the middle strata. The second point is to understand right-wing populism as a counter-revolutionary effort against progressive victories, as opposed to other forms of populism, including conservative populism. I want to emphasize this because certainly within much of the labor left in the US, there was a certain narrative that attacked the Democratic Party for abandoning the working class in the name of embracing neoliberalism. And this explained somehow the growth of right-wing populism among white workers and white middle strata. And I thought that analysis was pretty much off base. One, because the Democratic Party was never a workers' party. But then second, if you start looking at the demographic shifts in the electoral realm in the United States, they really kick off after 1964 and 1965, years before capitalism started entering one of its more recent crises. And why was that? What happened in 1964 and 65? Could it have had something to do with the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act? As Lyndon Johnson, then president, pointed out when he said that the Democratic Party had lost the South for at least a generation. As it turned out, he was being optimistic. And so we started to see the shift that was not rooted primarily with the Democrats moving away from workers, but it had to do with the struggle that was taking place, the freedom struggles that were going on, that were forcing shifts within the Democratic Party and leading the Republican Party, as a friend of mine articulated, to become the non-Black party, which helps to lay the foundation for much of what we later see. The third point is that this really becomes quite evident after the 1964 presidential race that involved Barry Goldwater, and decisions made by segments of his campaign, led by people like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich and others, that there needed to be a very well orchestrated effort to advance far-right politics, which was at that point came to be called the New Right. And this element was very strategic, both in deciding to penetrate the Republican Party and align itself with Richard Nixon, even though they despised Nixon as a liberal, but to align with Nixon as a way of building their strength. But they also had a multi-layered effort and also multi-decade that included efforts to build electoral campaigns, litigation, as well as mass movements. And they, through the cadre that they developed, they were able quite successfully to promote quite fascinating right-wing mass movements like the anti-abortion, anti-busing, anti-Panama Canal Treaty, guns issues, and some others, where the barrier to entrance was very low. And as opposed to us on the left, where you generally have to agree with 95% of what we're saying before we'll let you into the lobby. What the right wing articulated was that, for example, to enter into the anti-abortion movement, you didn't have to have a position on guns or on the Panama Canal. You just had to have a position on abortion. And it was within those movements that they were able to build up a very important culture that made it easier to start to transform people's thinkings beyond those single issues, from which we could learn a great deal. So there was multi-level effort on this. My fourth point is that, building on what Ingar said, neoliberalism is one central characteristic in laying the foundation for the growth of the most recent elements of right-wing populism. But I would also argue the larger crisis that the United States faced and its decline, the growth of immigration, which I think has affected the growth of right-wing populism internationally, the dramatic impact of changing demographics and immigration from the global South, the environmental crisis, which has also contributed to questions of the further existence of humanity and raised questions that dovetail with the issue of immigration, about who should society be looking out for as we face the potential of larger collapse. And then one of the triggers, most recently in the United States, was the election of Obama. And that the election of Obama, the election of a Black person as president, shook the bejeebies out of the political right and of large numbers of white people who came to conclude that the white republic, as the United States had largely been conceptualized, was now under existential threat. And so the Obama presidency did this, and Obama himself contributed in a very strange way. His very existence mobilized the right, but his cautiousness and his advance of neoliberal economics demobilized the forces that were necessary in order to confront the right. So we ended up getting the worst of both worlds, an energized right and a demobilized popular democratic force who felt like we simply couldn't count on this person and his administration that was supposed to be introducing some new approaches. A fifth point. So the Republican Party, the Republican establishment initially treated the right-wing populist movement much the way Dr. Frankenstein treated the monster. And that their notion was that the right-wing populist movement was a creature that it could control. Now, many of us on the left believed that, and far too long, so that when the rise of the Tea Party in the first years of Obama's administration, there were many people that described that as what was called an astroturf movement. And they assumed that it was a movement that was simply manipulated by the Republican establishment and elements of capital, not appreciating that it was a movement that was far more than something manipulated by the top, but that it had its roots in and could be seen to have been developing over at least 40 years. The problem with the Republican establishment's approach is that they did believe that they could control the monster until Trump. And the rising of Trump was the monster, was in many ways the monster becoming self-aware. Not that Trump was by himself the monster, although obviously he is a monster, but that Trump, as the title of my article said, was the rattle on the tail of the rattlesnake. It was not the head of the rattlesnake. And so Trump comes to signify this monster that has become self-aware and which was prepared to rip away at the Republican establishment, as we saw in the 2015-2016 period. The rallying of the Republican establishment to Trump, at least until recently, was largely about self-preservation because their base had become very much moved to the right. The former liberal forces, politically liberal forces that had been within the Republican Party had largely been driven out. So competition within the Republican Party became much more narrow. And so challenging the monster became that much more problematic for any of these candidates. And so the Republican establishment starts moving further and further to the right until it has ultimately embraced the politics of dictatorship. And we can see that through their response to the 2020 election, the January 6, 2021 coup attempt, the use of voter suppression, the adherence to the big lie. And what we can see in a number of states where constant efforts are underway in order to limit who can vote and how votes will be counted. The sixth point I raise then is, in terms of looking forward, contrary to those that believed that after January 6th, that the far right had been defeated and that we could turn our attention back to going against centrist Democrats. I'm talking about the national level. I'm not talking about any particular state. We face the challenge of right-wing terror, voter suppression, and legislative obstruction that are orchestrated by forces on the far right. And these forces have an armed wing, which became evident not just recently. In the 1980s, we saw fascist forces in the Midwest and the Northwest of the United States that were prepared to engage in various forms of armed struggle. We saw this again at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh, the militia movement, and many efforts undertaken to expose the danger of the armed right have been dismissed as paranoia, or they've been dismissed by the Republican establishment as an attempt to squash political discourse, as opposed to a recognition of the grave danger that these forces present, which therefore leading to my seventh point, we've got to think about what the implications of all of this are. And so first and foremost, we need a strong left, which at its core has what I called in a piece, the modern Tecumseh. We need a coherent socialist left that is working tirelessly to build a broad united front against the far right. But we also need to be building left progressive forces and organizations that are articulating alternatives in the fight for more immediate governing power. And that building a front against the far right by itself that is as broad as I'm suggesting will not be enough if we're not also building the efforts at fighting for an alternative. Now, before someone starts trying to smear me with the whole issue of being a popular frontier, I will say that unapologetically, I'm ready to unite with anybody that's prepared to fight against the fascists and the right-wing populists. And anybody, even if they're a Republican, I don't really care. That the danger is that acute. But that's not the making of a strategic alliance. The strategic alliance needs to be really rooted in the fight for an alternative set of politics that can actually inspire a popular democratic bloc that can move us in a direction of social transformation. I don't think that it's a one or the other. I think that it is both, recognizing the extent of the danger that we're up against. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. You can see why Bill is one of the most forceful voices on the left in the US on all matters, but particularly this one. And he does it so well, even though he's wearing his Mets hat. And I'll let that go. The Jays are going to give them a good run this year, but enough inside baseball stuff. Finally, we have Samir Gandesha writing on identity crisis, the politics of false concreteness. Samir teaches at Simon Fraser University in the humanities. His most recent book is Spectres of Fascism. He's writing in this volume particularly on the fragmentation of universalism and the politics of the left, which he then links to terminology that he takes from the Frankfurt School on false concreteness and the dilemmas it poses in building a socialist politics for today, which he deals with both at a theoretical level and some of the practical disputes on the ground that have divided the left, and which Samir has been commenting on as both a writer, but also as a public intellectual in Canada and around the world, often also in Germany, research on those matters. My old friend, we first met in London in the 1980s. I've got to tell that Leo and I decided to make sure we invited Samir to contribute when we met after a jazz club late at night in Soho in London after the Historical Materialism Conference. It was a brilliant move on both our parts, but so turning it over to you, Samir.
Well, thanks very much, Greg. Well, I appreciate the comment that it was a brilliant move on your part, but I would say that it was a truly moving night for me, especially, retrospectively. That was the last time I saw Leo, and it was just so wonderful to have had that moment together with you guys. And yes, as you say, the context really was that I was there in London for Historical Materialism to actually appear on a panel devoted to Assad Haider's very important book, Mistaken Identity, Race and Class in the Age of Trump. I mean, this is a really important book, but also, somewhat flawed in ways. And that was really the spark of further reflections on the question of identity politics. There's some additional context here as well, insofar as I'm also director of the Institute for the Humanities, and we put on what we called a free school that lasted basically a year, which consisted of a series of lectures on the rise of authoritarian populism, neo-fascism globally. And I think it was really important, and I really appreciated both Bill's and Ingar's comparative reflections and really trying to understand what we're facing here in a global perspective rather than in a narrowly nation state-based perspective. And I think this is really, really crucial. So that was an important aspect of it. The book that I edited, Spectres of Fascism, came right out of that series of lectures. Some lectures were not included, others were commissioned, other essays were commissioned. And one of the key organizing concepts of the book was Samir Amin's 2014 essay, I think really quite an important essay on the return of fascism in, I think, contemporary democracy, where he basically argues that fascism represents a categorical rejection of democracy in the interest of a collectivity that often was personified in a particular charismatic leader. And I thought this, written in 2014, was quite prescient. I would, in the introduction, I modified that to say not democracy per se, but liberal democracy. And this is key because you have these sort of versions of so-called illiberal democracy, don't you, with figures like Viktor Orban, and Putin himself makes a reference to this. And I think this was a key aspect of my reflections, insofar as authoritarian forms of populism, neo-fascism, are attempting to undermine democracy from within. And this is one of the things that Adorno is very clear about, that the threat to democracy from fascism doesn't lie from outside, but from inside. And I want to come back to that because that's an important frame for the essay that I've contributed to this volume. And one of the things that I was also noticing as director of the Institute, when we were trying to organize things, both academic and activists, right? We were trying to work with various groups within the community as part and parcel of the Institute's mission. The Institute was founded in the early 80s in very much of a kind of, the residual radical spirit of SFU. And so its mission was to work with various groups within civil society, sort of labor groups and so on, labor organizations, so on, to create a space for dialogue and debate, not unlike the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. I mean, it is kind of a space for critical and meaningful dialogue. And it seemed increasingly to be difficult to do this with or within certain left spaces, right? There seemed to be a kind of growing authoritarianism within the left, and this had to do, it seemed to me, with the increasing tendency towards a certain sort of identity politics. So I've been interested in the question of identity politics for some time, and in terms of, what is possible to organize, what are the limits and possibilities of organization. So that's also one dimension of this. I've also been working a little bit on the question of polarization through trying to understand populism, and I appreciate very much, Ingar, your discussion of the fallout of market polarization, right, which leads in many cases to right-wing authoritarianism or nationalism. But I think that one of the key aspects of this fallout is actually a kind of politics, right? And if we look at Guterman and Lewenthal's book, Prophets of Deceit, they show the way in which the agitator takes the kinds of fears and anxieties that are a result of the crisis of social cohesion and transform that into a kind of personalized attack on and construction of the enemy. And I think this is very much part of a kind of right-wing populist politics. So this is also part of the larger sort of frame of the discussion. I've written on Adorno and Ferenczi to also understand a kind of tendency towards an identification with the aggressor. I think this is also what Bill draws out of Fanon to talk about a certain colonial mentality by which the oppressed identify with precisely the conditions of their own oppression. I've looked at Adorno's social psychology to really identify the mechanisms by which people identify with figures who represent a kind of inflated sense of their own identities. And I suppose one of the most important aspects of Adorno's contribution that I also take up elsewhere is this idea that has come out in this recently published and then also subsequently translated lecture that he gave in 1967 at the University of Vienna on aspects of the new right-wing extremism, is what he calls the wound of democracy, right? And I think this is really important. He says, democracy has not yet become truly and fully concrete anywhere, but is still formal. In that sense, one might refer to the fascist movements as the wounds, the scars of democracy that to this day has not lived up to its own concept. And I think this is a good way into the argument I'm trying to make in this chapter, which is to say that while there are real limitations to the kind of analogical thinking that says, well, we're back in this sort of Weimar moment, what we can perhaps look at are the responses to Weber's account of rationalization disenchantment that he lays out in his two lectures at the University of Munich in 1919. And you see in the thinkers of the so-called conservative revolution, figures like Carl Schmitt, Ernst Jünger, and particularly Martin Heidegger, is a certain kind of rejection of abstraction, a particular kind of rejection of the conditions of an admittedly anemic liberal democracy in the interest of something that is substantial, something that's concrete, something that's meaningful, something that is existential. And I suppose it's more of a question that I pose in the chapter about how we might be able to understand precisely this kind of logic or this kind of polarization today, to account not just for the kinds of things that Bill and Ingar have discussed with incredible detail and precision and insight, which is the way in which the far right can pose in certain ways, as Ingar, you put it, drawing on Adorno's social psychology, a certain kind of collective narcissism as a response, as a false response or a false solution to the real problem of the domination of abstractions in our lives. But to what extent can we see this also to some extent on the left, right, where the claim to the immediacy of experience, the idea that only certain people can speak about certain topics or certain forms of literature or certain artworks, which seems to close and undermine the very things that we need today, the possibility of critical judgment and critique. And I think that these constituents of what Atu Seixiotu, my former teacher, dear old teacher from York from many years ago, calls left universalism. And his intervention is really a polemical one. And he's writing from Ghana, from an African context. And he is trying to retrieve a certain kind of universalism, which from the quarters of left identity politics has all but been abandoned. I mean, this is an open question. I'm sure it'll come into the discussion, but in my view, universalism is really on the retreat and has been since, I think, the late 1980s, if not earlier. And it's precisely a kind of left universalism that would enable us to provide real solutions to the real problems that we identify, not least because we need to have some conception of totality. We need to have some conception of the way in which abstraction must be understood in mediated ways, as opposed to in these unreflective and unmediated ways, which leads to a kind of identity politics of the right, as well as an identity politics of the left. Abstraction itself is part of part and parcel. It's a moment of universalism that cannot be just rejected out of hand, but perhaps subjected to further critique. And I think at the end of the day, and perhaps I'll just conclude here and open it up. I think the possibility of the kind of unity of the left hinges precisely upon getting our relation to abstraction in general right, but I think also liberal democracy in particular right, because I see that on the far right, of course, there's this categorical rejection of liberal democracy, but I think that on the left there is a creeping skepticism of liberal democracy itself, not as something that, of course, ought to be defended, but something that needs to be transformed and further democratized. So I think that, I would put it in this way, that we can find ourselves in danger of engaging in just an abstract negation of liberal democracy, as opposed to a determinate one, where aspects of it are taken up and deepened, while other aspects are canceled insofar as they are democratized. So I think I'll leave it there, and I think we then have probably about 50 minutes for discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Samir, for drawing us from the concrete to a range of universal propositions back into the concrete, reordered, and an interesting way of thinking about identity politics and its relationship to polarization. Michael, I take you're going to manage kind of the question period?
Yes, I will, so that some people may even have a question for you, Greg, and I hope that all of you
Sure, but with these eminent people, I don't know. I'm going to be a bit nervous answering anything on these questions with these three here.
Carl, why don't you start, and we'll see if other people join the queue. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'll make a point with an example. When I was around 18, a bunch of us here in Western Pennsylvania, I'm young, we have blue collar reality here. We got in a car and drove off to the Newport Jazz Festival in 1960. And when we hit New Jersey and went through New York and into New England, we just laughed our asses off. Every time we came into a diner, we said, all these people have accents. And we tried to imitate the New Jersey accent and the New England accent. and we could hardly understand them. But everybody had accents except us. We just talked normal, you know. And I'm sure you all know Pittsburgh's got a very unique accent, but that's my point about identity politics. We all have an identity. All politics are composed in part, in large part, of identities, and we all have an identity that we bring to it. Just like, even though I didn't know I had an accent, I brought an accent to any discussion that I was in. So what's important for us, I think, is to understand the identity. Most people do not vote simply on the issues or the platform. There have been a number of surveys and even books written on this that they do to a certain extent, but to a large extent, people vote on the basis of their identity. And, you know, Biden in the last election tried to appeal to us. He says, this is not who we are, when he's arguing, you know, with Trump and him. But when you think about it, Biden was wrong to a considerable extent. The politics of the United States, say in 1920, 22, was it was the same or worse than the right-wing populists are today. And that was the norm in the United States. It was who we are. Bill's right that the right-wing populism has a long and deep roots, and in many cases it has been the norm. What we have then is not simply arguing within the working class on the question of platform or issues, although we should do that. We also have a more formidable task, which is one of reconstructing identity. And then to do that, I think we need to borrow a concept of Gramsci's, which is conflicted consciousness. I don't like the idea of false consciousness at all. I think it's useless. It's elitist, and it implies a metaphysical true consciousness. But conflicted consciousness is something we all have, every single one of us, in different ways. And when we're working and organizing, we have to try to understand and get a hold of the conflicts in the consciousnesses of the people we're trying to win over, so that we can work in a longer range way of trying to reshape it. Getting rid of the white race conception would be a good one. You know, I first discovered that, and I'll close on this note. A long time ago, I had a girlfriend, and she was arguing with me one day. She said, "Carl, you know what's wrong with you? You think you're a man." Well, that sort of took me back. I said, "What do you know?" I didn't know what to say. But when I thought about it, she was right, because it was the same way of thinking that I'm a member of a white race. A white race is a fiction, and it's not something that I can belong to. It's something I might identify with, as a form of identity politics, but it has to be chipped away. So that's part of the more difficult and longer task we have in fighting a right-wing populism.
Thank you, Carl. We also have Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, everyone, and thanks to three great speakers. When I was thinking about the question I wanted to ask, it seemed to apply to all three, but right now I can only think of how it applies to Bill and Samir's presentation. And it kind of boils down to what's the time frame? And in a way, Carl, your comments reinforce what I wanted to say. Like, how much time do we have in terms of what the right wing is doing, which Bill called great attention to? And there's a sentence towards the end of Bill's essay that says, forces on the left must be willing to unite with those in the Democratic Party who are strategically our opponents, but who at this moment are in opposition, hostile opposition to forces on the right who are advancing authoritarianism. And Samir, at the end, you were talking about ambivalent relations on the left to the question of liberal democracy. And the reason why I put it in terms of how much time we have is because there are people who are working at very local levels, just like the right wing is, organizing drives in units or districts of Starbucks, or running for school board, doing very local things. And then on the other hand, there are people who are allying with those forces in the Democratic Party to raise money to save the Senate or keep a majority in the House of Representatives. And those are two very different propositions, because you could say right now we need to preserve the slender majority in the Senate in order to keep the wolves outside the door. And the people who are, there's a website, there's an organization called Run for Something, which is really worth reading. And you could say that the ideology there is encouraging illusions about liberal democracy with great passion. And yet, a lot of young people, including young people that now I have the pleasure to work with, they just want to do something. And at the risk in the long run of falling victim to these liberal illusions, and illusions of liberal democracy. And I'll end with one point. When I read Samir's article, I almost had to stop at the first paragraph because, so as some of you know from other things here, I'm from Boston. So the first paragraph has a semi-positive reference to Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh's initiatives to encourage organizing. And around here, some of us will say, when Walsh became Secretary of Labor, Boston's gain was the country's loss, because he is not really much of anything. And yet he is the sort of liberal Democrat that it seems we have to ally with right now. So I'm wondering, what is our time frame? What do things really look like on the ground in the next 2, 4, 5 years? And what should we be telling people who are 22 and want to do something?
Greg, you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Just a quick clarification. Steve is referring to Samir Sante's essay on developments in the U.S. and not Samir. So
Okay.
just to explain Samir's, that's where the Walsh reference is. And yeah, we kind of debated back and forth with the other Samir on the point.
I was a bit confused there. Yeah.
Yeah. But in any case, it's a good. The point you're making is still relevant. I might just add another point, following on from Carl's question. David Harvey in this volume's register comes back to a thesis from W.E.B. Du Bois on consciousness and kind of the tensions within Marx around that, not just in the sense of false consciousness in the way you raised it, but also in kind of the search for kind of the transcendent possibilities of socialism along the goal, the objective, the vision, alongside the practical material possibilities, which he raises throughout as a tension throughout the essay. And it strikes me that that formulation from Du Bois is still very helpful for dealing with a range of the ways of forming a new politics. I don't know Du Bois's influence from or not of the Frankfurt School, but maybe Samir or others could speak to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll let Bill address the last question, but Carl's question I think is a really good one, and the way I would approach that is to say that the best imminent criticism of identity politics can be found in The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, where he acknowledges that at the beginning of the anti-colonial struggle, identity in a kind of undifferentiated way, in terms of a kind of logic of colonizer colonized is key to organizing the struggle, right? This is absolutely key. But in a sense, the struggle is organized externally, precisely by the conditions laid down by colonialism itself, right? So there's a kind of immediacy of unity that's established. Once that initial stage is finished, once the colonizers are driven out, then a more differentiated political field appears, where now there are class distinctions, right? Class divisions amongst the formerly colonized. And I think you could say that already, in a sense, hinges at a sort of doubled consciousness, right? That comes to the fruition once independence has been established. And that is such a crucial period of struggle, isn't it, in terms of determining the nature of the post-colonial state and whether the post-colonial state is going to maintain its subordinate position vis-a-vis imperialism, global capital, or whether it's going to be able to carve out a certain kind of autonomy that would respond to the needs and aspirations of the people. So absolutely, identity is key to politics, but how do we understand it? Do we understand it as static and fixed, almost like a form of property that we can lay a claim of ownership to, which is how I'm presenting a certain sort of false concreteness? Or is it something that's dynamic and internally differentiated and differentiatable? And the last point is that I think that when we talk often about intersectionality, and intersectionality is a more critical way of understanding identity and identity politics, there's still this kind of hierarchization, isn't there? So you have race and gender and sexual orientation, gender identity and class, as if these are somehow equivalent. Because if we're really thinking about class as a critical category, we're thinking about class as a negative category, one that can't be properly included within a neoliberal order, right? I mean, it can be included, but it can't be properly included. It is the crisis of not just the neoliberal order, but the capitalist order. I mean, this is Marx, right? The struggle is oriented towards the transcendence of class society, meaning the transcendence of the identity of the proletariat itself. So it's a negative identity. Whereas I think you have in identity politics these claims for positive affirmation that are indexed to historical injustices and historical wrongs. And that one understands this, right? But I think the two are different. One functions critically and negatively, the other one functions affirmatively and more positively. So I think that is the discussion that's really quite important for the left to have. But I think even today, having a discussion that's critical about identity politics becomes itself increasingly difficult, if not, beyond the pale. So that's what I wanted to say to Carl's point.
We'll go in reverse order, and you next, Bill, and then we'll have Ingar after you. Go ahead.
Cool. Ahead. So 2 points. One, I want to first start with a response to Steve's question and give you a sort of convoluted answer. How much time do we have? Well, it depends on a few things, and among which depends on what part of the country you're in. So I'd say in Florida, we have no time. That the monster is upon us, and that there's a very particular kind of fight in Florida and Texas that has to be undertaken, and it's desperate. I'd say at the national level, in terms of time, that we're going to see what happens in 2024. My guess is that if Trump or DeSantis gets in through whatever mechanism, there's going to be a very quick and then also a very slow move towards an authoritarian democracy, which I realize is an oxymoron. But I think that we're seeing that in a number of Republican-dominated, I refuse to use the term red, Republican-dominated states. And I think that what we need to do right now, among other things, is split the right. There's something that I remember, which is reading in a military context, that if you understand and defeat someone's strategy, you've defeated them. And I don't think that we understand enough about the strategy of the other side, but we have to split them up. Now, right now, some elements of the right are splitting up largely because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in ways that a few weeks ago I would never have expected the kind of splintering that seems to be happening. But I think that this has to be deepened. In terms of the issue of identity politics, Samir, I would start though with what do we mean by identity politics? Because I feel like sometimes it's like pin the tail on a donkey. You put something around your eyes and you're in a dark room and you just sort of touch something and you're hoping to get it right. That if by identity politics, if what we mean is what postmodernism means, which is that there is no universal principles, as you were describing, that it's all sectoral, or as a good friend of mine used to say, only whales can critique Moby Dick. If that's what you're talking about, that's one thing. If you're talking about identity politics at the level of a repudiation of determinism and economism, I think that that's something different. I think that we have to define exactly what we're talking about. And particularly in the US context, where the left has historically chosen to downplay struggles around race and gender. And you know, you sometimes feel like you're walking up the declining escalator. So I think that we have to be clear about this. I think I hear where you are. I'm inclined sort of in the direction you are, but I think that it necessitates far more clarification. And to which I'd also add this, which I think in some sense builds on what Carl was raising. I think that there is always a matter of the identity of the oppressed, and that the identity of the oppressed transforms at times depending on the nature of the principal contradiction. And so how the oppressed identify and recognize each other as being in the same block is about identity. And so like when I was writing the piece, The Mind of Tecumseh, part of what I was arguing is that part of what Tecumseh was attempting to do was transform the identity of Native Americans and have them break from their principal identification being with the tribe to an identification with a larger Indian confederacy, possibly a prototype for an Indian nation. You can see the same thing in what Mao argued in China, that the people, as he said it, changes and transforms at different stages in the revolution. That's nothing more than identity. Who are the people? And so I think that we have to be more precise. There is an oppression Olympics that is underway, as you're describing, with different people asserting that their oppression is so unique that there's no basis for unity, that no one else comes close. And those are the politics of defeat, although they're varnished in revolution. And so we have to repudiate that. We're really talking about overdetermination. I think that's where we're getting into the issue of the way that these forms of oppression and social contradictions come together and how they need to be articulated at any one moment.
Thank you, Bill. Ingar, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. I got kicked out for at least 2 minutes. So sorry, Bill. I missed maybe like 1.5 minutes of what you said. While I think that I draw a lot on the Frankfurt School to understand authoritarianism. I think it's, like with the categories like authoritarian aggression versus and authoritarian submission, all of these are still crucial when it comes to understanding, say, like phenomenons of the far right, like conspiracy theories. I think it's very useful to understand them as a form also of religiousness, like where authoritarian submission under like, a new house of order, an ideological house of order come in play. But at the same time, I think there's also limits to the general framework of the Frankfurt School understanding of authoritarianism. which are twofold, I would say. Number one, that in Adorno, authoritarianism is merely rooted in the sphere of reproduction, that it's mostly oriented, it's the father that is implementing authoritarian right-wing ideology or right-wing personality traits in an individual. And so that it's essentially neglecting the sphere of production as like a root of authoritarian behavior, authoritarian ideologies, as you can find it in, like, say, the research by Christoph Butterwegge or Klaus Dörre, and also like some of the writings by Joe Bagent and other people like that. And secondly, that it identifies a personality trait that determines essentially the political behavior and ideology of individuals in a kind of personality structure, as opposed to a more dynamic understanding of authoritarianism as you find it in Bob Altemeyer or Karen Stanner and or Moritz Marquardt in the critical psychology school in Germany. So I'm also like more oriented towards like essentially like what Carl Davidson was saying, like conflicted consciousness that is rooted in material foundations, but is also volatile. And that leads me to kind of Bill Fletcher's strategic conclusions. I mean, Leo, I remember at one point he said, why do workers vote for neoliberal parties? Like, why is it even possible? Is it false consciousness? And he argued, well, for some workers, tax cuts are the best way to, supplement their income or to improve their living conditions. So it's a question, it's a question of whether there is a left alternative to those kinds of augmentations of living standards. And that also leads to a kind of volatile situation where like a lot can shift. And I want to recall Poulantzas' argument that the rise of fascism or the victory of fascism in the 30s was not because capitalism was under attack or threatened by the left, but that things had become so dire, the crisis, like our crisis today, had become so dire that like it had to, like that the left was too weak, that in this situation where the left was too weak to challenge the system as a whole, the far right could fill the vacuum. And I think that also describes in many ways the situation that we're in, that a lot of people, including workers, turn to the right because the left does not have, like, cannot realistically say and claim that it can change, like to really actually change living conditions for workers too. And that brings me to this identity and class politics question, because I'm not sure whether it's like posed correctly. I mean, many people on the left respond to it. Okay, we see we've realized that there is class is an issue. We've had this debate, like this Eribon debate, and after his 2009 book, which was translated in 2016 in Germany, so it coincided with the Trump, Bolsonaro, etc. moment where people suddenly realize, oh my God, we forgot about class. And so we have to be intersectional, we have to integrate race, gender, and class. But they do it in a way so that class becomes just another identity, just another form of discrimination, and to which liberal politics, of course, responds by, okay, then we have to have affirmative action, not only for race and gender, but also for class, which with Leo, I would argue his essay in the 2000 Register on the Working Class, that class is not an identity, but class is a social relation, and it is like heavily genderized and ethnicized, of course, like, right, like disproportionately people of color and feminized. So with regards to that, I would say that like to tackle the right means to tackle like the image that the right can present of the left, namely that the left is a force that shelters certain social groups from the mercilessness of the market, by essentially, finding some sort of positive discrimination or anti-discrimination policies. But of course, that means like that you're not addressing the feminized and racialized working class as a whole. And I think like to have a class politics that is both at the same time not reductionist, class reductionist, and at the same time feminist and anti-racist, I think you have to move to what Samir, what you were referring to, like a kind of new universalism, like to develop policies that are universal in terms of benefiting all workers, but disproportionately benefiting people of color workers and female workers at the same time. And like two examples I want to give is, of course, like the $15 minimum wage would be such a politics, because of course it benefits people in the low wage sector in particular, which is disproportionately female and POC, or like the social housing campaigns, like the Berlin rent cap, for instance. Like it is inherently feminist because it enables women to leave abusive husbands. Like, you know, it enables women who are in the low wage sector disproportionately to find a new apartment and not have to stick with abusive husbands, and so on and so forth. Like, so to develop those kinds of policies that are universalist in nature, or like in language also, but are anti-racist, ecological, and feminist in and of themselves. And that leads me to my last point, like the popular front strategy. I would say that the difference between historic fascism and today's neo-fascism or right-wing authoritarian nationalism is that at least up to this point in history, historical fascism was functional to the dominant faction of the or to the bourgeoisie. At that point, nationally organized bourgeoisies. But for like up to this point, like say like something like the AfD in Germany is dysfunctional to global capitalism and the transnational factions of capital that are dominant in the power bloc. And so the Popular Front strategy was correct in the 30s, but as long as the far right is marginalized, it might not be the correct strategy. And I mentioned at the end of my talk that maybe we are shifting towards a renationalization of capitalism. Then this question has to be framed very differently. But up to this point, I would have argued that the Popular Front strategies are incorrect because you're marginalizing a force that is already marginalized in terms of who essentially calls the shots in the core capitalist country states.
Thank you, Ingar. We now have, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Previn, and then after you will be Herman, who on my Zoom screen is right next to you, so it's very appropriate. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Michael, for allowing me to talk. My main question, I guess, is aimed at Bill, whom I felt had a whole bunch of really strategically fascinating insights into ways in which the left can combat the right. And I found Bill's position quite daring and bold in the way he's stepping out of, let's say, a hard left position. But I think what interested me in what you were saying was that there are kind of a few assumptions driving what you were actually giving solutions for. And one is this really hard problem with the left, which is that theoretically it does not appear to be sustaining itself in the forces of history. And therefore, do we need some kind of theoretical reevaluation of the foundations? Does dialectical materialism work? Does the mediated concept and in Adorno work? Because something else is going on in history, which we know. We can't talk about fascism on the right. There's fascism on the left. Samir was alluding to how difficult it is to create spaces in the left to discuss our own issues. So something is going on that cuts across left and right, which is quite disordered, I think, mentally disordered, but interesting for that reason. And Bill, I was wondering, do we have to kind of rethink, does the left have to rethink some of its very fundamental assumptions? And it plays around, why, if we run with false consciousness for a little bit with Lukács and Adorno, why is there false consciousness? Why don't the oppressed see their oppression? Why is it such a horrifically difficult task to see the obvious? Okay, there is some kind of block here. And whether we go the Gramsci route of reconstructing identity, how? Because where are we since Gramsci? How do we reconstruct identity given the historical forces and their trajectory? So I'm wondering about some kind of very fundamental reevaluation that the left needs to undergo of itself, not abandon Marx's principles or even his methodology necessarily, but certainly a fundamental rethink of some of the goddamn basic mechanics, because this shit is not working, man. It's not working, and that implies that we have not understood something. So that's kind of one of my questions, Bill. And the other one is about Jacques Rancière's staging the people, that the left continuously stages the people within a certain framework. And Rancière's point, particularly in his book, Staging the People, I think it's called The Intellect and His Double, is that we can, as intellectuals, stage the people in many ways and ask for things and demand things from the people. And what Rancière is kind of saying is that, you know, we miss something. And what he says, which is agonizing to read, is that fundamentally the working class people do not feel oppressed. They don't feel this oppression that we keep telling them that they've got oppression or they're being exploited or whatever. That is not how they see it. And the horrific conclusion is, he's saying there is something fascist and right-wing in the psychological block of the working classes. And although the intellectual left come along and say, hey, we need to reframe and restage you, and you need emancipation and empowerment and liberation, they're just telling us to piss off. You know, they're not interested in us. And then they marginalize us like, oh, well, we're the intellectuals, or we're the left, or we're the whatever. And there's a problematic there as well about, has the left understood this? That what if, you know, we're looking, Marx is saying, you know, the discontent of the working class will eventually overthrow the monopoly capitalism and its consequences. But have we misread the working class? And that's one of my problematics with some of the fundamental assumptions. And that's why we're having to align with the Republicans. That's why we have to align with the Democrats, because suddenly there's no time to be saying, oh, it's the right and the left. Okay, now we're actually faced with serious destruction politically and governmentally. So I'm just wondering about some of the fundamentals. I'm thinking about Jacques Rancière, Staging the People. And I wonder, Bill, behind everything you were saying, is there some kind of acceptance that, hey, we need some fundamental rethink going on here, man?
Thanks. Herman. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Bill, I just got the book a couple of days ago, and I read your article this morning, and I liked it. I thought it made a lot of sense. The analysis I thought was pretty sound, and I was looking for the bugaboo of a popular front, and it was not there. And it wasn't there, just like you said it wasn't. And I think, like I said, I think it made a lot of sense. And yeah, what you say about Florida certainly I think is definitely true. My issue is that you talk about ultimately the left has to come to power, has to have a strategy for doing it. Who is the left? And I don't really. There is a lot of left, but I don't see a socialist left coalescing or building and trying to develop work with the kind of mixed consciousness that working people always have. Except it's always shaped by all kinds of things in labor markets, the strategy of capital, all the points that people are raising that Ingar and Carl made about how you characterize a conscience, which I thought was a very good one, a very apt one. Who's doing that work? Isn't that supposed to be one of the central components of building the base of the left, like socialists working in different communities, in workplaces, around unions, developing strategies with workers, but also doing education about the interactions of class and race and gender, and trying to build a common sense of working people that we're part of a class, because a lot of working class people don't see that. In fact, they don't act that way because that doesn't just happen. It's got to be built, And I very much disagree with some of the points that were just made. Reminded me by the last questioner. Reminded me of the first text that I had in political science in the Miami of Ohio, Political Man by Seymour Martin Lipset. There was a whole chapter called Working Class Authoritarianism, and I don't think it really made much sense at the time. Anyway, thanks.
And Greg, you're on stack. Go ahead.
Yeah. One point on something that Ingar raised from his talk and then came back to is I'd still be a bit cautious in how much we're seeing any kind of renationalization, with the value chains being so deep and encrusted that it would be hard to kind of reverse those in any significant way, given the fixed capital investments that are involved, both in the factories that exist around the world, and and the logistics structures, fixating them, linking them up. Sorry. So I'd be a bit cautious, and if there was, there might be some, but if it was, to do it fully is a very long-term project. But but I'm not saying you're completely wrong at all. But I would just pose it a little bit differently, as I think maybe what we're seeing is a certain division that's occurring, partition in around two zones, that has been evident somewhat. The U.S. really pushing hard to concentrate in and around its zone, and China has been on a long-term project for a while to deepen a dependence on its zone. The difficulty of it kind of completely moving in the direction of de-dollarization or renationalization of production streams is still that the core linkage in globalization is still between China and the U.S. and it's the unwinding of that just still doesn't seem to be quite what anybody wants to do right now. At the same time this is going on, there's been a very deep linking of Chinese and American capital markets through American capital entering into the effort of the Chinese to deepen their capital markets. So I think you're right to pose the issue, though, and it's very hard to read where it's going at. But another dimension of what you were saying, and Bill was commenting on, and want all of your assessments is something goes along that, is where it seems to me that we're still in a phase where the center is moving to the right. One could make a strong case that the SPD and government now calling for the remilitarization of Germany is as big a betrayal to the world's working classes as World War One. And it's just a major shift, and the consequence of everybody now upping their arms spending will have an incredible consequence. And I can't see this but pushing and pulling further to the right. And all the hope that was reflected, say, or cautious hope that was reflected, say, in Samir Santi's essay in the volume, cautious but very, very cautious, still dependent on whether the U.S. working classes could organize about Build Back Better on an anti-neoliberal project, seems to me fading a bit too. Whether it's fading, at least in the sense of being an alternative project that pulls us back to the center left, as opposed to maybe gets rid of an aspect of neoliberalism, but is still positioned on the right in an alternative form. And it seems to me that there's very little that's pulling the center to the left, as opposed to keep pulling it to the right. I can't but see the war and how it's turning right now, with also kind of putting an emphasis on that. So I'm just wanted to get, actually, I don't, not searching for a right answer, just to understand more people's different interpretations of this precise moment.
I had another question related to Ingar that I'll put out in less than 30 seconds, which is the digitization and precarity of all working class and professionals is driving many people into a petty bourgeois way of replicating themselves, which in many other ways is undermining what we think of as working class consciousness. And we see this in the Rust Belt and other areas where there were lots of union jobs that are now people out Uber driving, but maybe opening little shops, etc. And the conditions of that type of replicating oneself quite often lead to a rightist politics. But David, be very quick. I tried to be quick myself. Go ahead.
All three very great presentations and very good essays, very interesting. Raised a lot of questions in my mind. But one thing I just was curious about, how you all understand the situation. Well, it goes back to the first one who said, well, what is the left? And we also say, what is the right? We sort of throw these terms around. We haven't exactly defined what they are. it seems to me that the alt-right, the new right, the far right, however you want to call it, I mean, the essence of their position, in not only in the United States and in Europe and other countries, India, is nationalism and traditionalism as sort of the same thing. And this idea that there's something unique and special about whatever nation you happen to belong to, as opposed to other nations and its history. And a lot of the hostility that has been used to whip up this kind of mass version of this is hostility against globalism, neoliberalism, if you will. And what I don't understand is, how do we explain that a large portion of very, very high level capitalists, not only in the United States and Britain and other countries, are willing to bankroll and support this kind of nationalism, when it seems that their business interests as capitalists are, well, their businesses are international, because all giant businesses are international now. And for them, or 90% of them are.
David,
That's it. That's it.
Wrap up.
That's it.
Okay.
It seems their business interests require globalism and not narrow nationalism. So I don't understand their politics from the point of view of class.
I'd like to go back to the original present. Ingar, then Bill, then Samir, and go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for those excellent points. I'm trying to limit it to two. On the one hand, like when I speak of renationalization as a possible development, like what I'm talking about is more in line with the emulation of China's state interventionism as a way of competing, rivaling China's hyper-competitiveness in terms of, 5G, artificial intelligence, like with all the technologies that are evolving from it, like from 5G, autonomous driving, smart city, etc., etc. What's interesting is like that on the one hand, the West has been learning that it needs to go there essentially, like the European industrial policy of the European Commission that was supposed to come out in March 2020 of all moments in history, namely the Corona situation with the collapse of supply chains, etc., and the renationalization of certain aspects of the economy, right? Like some elements of command economy, moments like with Trump shifting back to like the Korea War economic policies. So that like on the one hand, you see like this recognition, but when it comes to real politics, you see how like any attempt to move in that direction seems to fail. Like, I mean, the failure of Bidenomics, which I would interpret as an element of shifting towards more state interventionism, again, also directed against China, but also like the new center-left government in Germany that failed to undo balanced budget amendments and failed to essentially increase taxation on capital to fund such an undertaking. But like what I do observe is that there might be the attempt to create national players in a still, of course, globalized capitalist economy, but like to essentially create rivals to state-led or state-run companies in China. So maybe we must talk about some element of neoliberal nationalism or something like that as a potential political force in the future, and to assess how the far right might fit into such a framework or might not fit into such a framework. Because I think, like, at least in terms of Germany, the AfD will have to give in to the re-strengthening of NATO. I mean, it is now still like in no man's land, so to speak, to use that war metaphor, when it comes to dealing with Putin's war in the Ukraine. But I think that there'll be significant changes, like significant pressure also to adapt because they're in favor of military spending, and they're not against the military. They just held a slightly pro-Russian position. Michael, that's a great point with regards to what digitization does to working class consciousness. I totally agree. I just wanted to raise one last point when it comes to popular front politics, namely, I mean, I'm not like, I occasionally write about the US, but or like that's how I started out as a writer. But follow your arguments with regards to the strategic decision. I never subscribed to Aronowitz's or Rick Wolf's position in Left Turn at the time, where they tried to demand like an independent left party. And I was on board with the Sanders movement. But I think when it comes to popular front politics in the proportional representation systems, it's a matter entirely different. To just give you an example with regards to what Greg mentioned with the military spending, like the 100 billion that are going to be spent on the German army, which will be triple the amount of what Russia spends in this year alone. And that's just one NATO member state out of 30, which is, of course, like a disastrous development. Like this was put in motion on like a day prior to when it was decided. And it was also presented to Die Linke without the entire figures, but Die Linke was determined to stay neutral on the issue because they didn't want to be seen as voting against it in line with the far right. And only when it came out that, like the 100 billion, etc., like it became clear, okay, we can't stay neutral on this issue. We have to vote against it, even if it means voting in line with the far right. But like the notion of the Popular Front, essentially, like it's ingrained in politicians of the left party in this terminology of like all Democrats have to stand together, or we can't be seen voting in line with the far right again. And like, so in proportional representation systems, I think it has created a lot of tactical and strategic mistakes, including some that led to the decline of the German left party in the 2021 election.
Thanks, Ingar. Bill, your turn. Very good.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of things to respond to, and I'm going to try to make it as concise as possible. First, I want to respond to Greg by saying that there's a Fletcher amendment to Marx and Engels. They emphasize that the masses make history. The Fletcher amendment is that individuals can screw it up. And so in 1990, the invasion of Kuwait screwed up immense possibilities that we had to take on the military establishment. The military establishment couldn't have hoped for someone as good as Saddam Hussein to have done that. And I would argue that the NATO hawks couldn't have prayed for someone as foolish as Putin to have launched this war in order to grease the wheels of militarization. They couldn't have expected something so amazing. But that's the world that we've been handed. And we'll have to deal with it. Who is the left? So I'm going to try to merge my responses to you and Previn. When I speak about the left, I'm talking about forces that are anti-capitalist. I'm not talking about Bill Clinton. I'm not talking about people that are generally progressive. I'm talking about people that are anti-capitalist and very diverse. And I think that one of the things that we're looking at right now, Previn, is there needs to be a rethinking and a refounding. But it's not about whether dialectical and historical materialism were flawed. I think more than anything else in the global north, our strategy and our conception of strategy has been flawed, accompanied by an abandonment of organization. One of the things that may seem surprising is that Reaganism had an amazing impact on the left and on progressive forces, because what it did was it debunked the notion of collective activity and instead replaced it with hyper-individualism in all fields and entrepreneurialism. Thus, this whole obsession with brand, which you even get within the left, and this articulation of politics as something that people do as individuals and a downplaying of organization. So I would say, Previn, that we've got to rethink strategy and we've got to rethink organization, and particularly the fight around governing power. The problems that we see recurring, where left forces get to power and then start practicing a neoliberal agenda. And instead of pushing the envelope on democratic capitalism, and why that keeps happening, this whole fight for legitimacy that seems to end up dragging the left down. So I would say that that's a major factor. But the other thing that speaks to part of what you're raising, Previn, I think, is the impact of race and imperial consciousness. That we cannot understand the impact of right-wing populism in the absence of appreciating racism and imperial consciousness, and the role that declining empires has had on the consciousness of working class people, who in many cases identified with their nation state as an imperial force, even when they would domestically be articulating the left agenda. The French Communist Party that was prepared to support the suppression of the Algerian Revolution up until quite late in the 1950s. I mean, how does anyone make sense out of that, right? So I think that we have to look at that, the way that racism and imperial consciousness have infected our larger working class, which leads to the final point, because we don't have time to go into this more. Well, actually, 2 points, we don't have time. One is that, Previn, I think workers do feel oppression all the time. I just think that, and in many cases, they feel oppression as workers. But what frequently happens is that the oppression ends up becoming interpreted through other lenses, unless it is specific to the particular situation that they happen to be in. In other words, that Black workers, when they are around other Black folks, will frequently articulate their class grievances against other Blacks. But once you put white people in the room, this becomes much more complicated. And so I think it's wrong to assume that workers aren't feeling oppression. They are all the time. And it plays itself out in psychological and political matters. But it also often gets redirected through other lenses of race, gender, or whatever. The last thing, Herman, is that I share your frustration with the left. I think that the left, as we know it, is splintering between two lefts. I think that there is an anti-authoritarian, anti-imperialist, pro-emancipatory left. And then I think that there is a campist left, C-A-M-P-I-S-T. I think that there is what I used to call knee-jerk anti-imperialists. I think that there are those that long for pre-1990 and long for when things were simpler, and they're not going to get simpler. And I think that we see these divergences becoming clear. The response to the Syrian uprising was a clear case of it. And then now looking at what's happening in Ukraine, but in other places, the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, I think that there's a divergence that is becoming clearer and clearer, so that there are people that I can no longer describe as comrades. We are tactical allies on certain issues.
Thank you, Bill. Samir, the Zoom room floor is yours to conclude today's panel.
Great, thanks. I'll try to be as brief as possible. First of all, I'd just like to respond to something that Ingar said, and that is that I don't think Adorno has just a psychologizing approach to authoritarianism, but it says in many places, and I think this is part of his diagnosis of the democratic wound, that in fact it's a contradiction between a kind of subjective disposition towards autonomy and an objective reality of heteronomy, of being governed by social forces beyond one's control. And this particularly hits the middle strata and the petty bourgeoisie, which feels then as a result increasingly precarious, especially in moments of crisis, and therefore predisposed to kind of right-wing authoritarian party politics and movement politics. So I think that there is that the social dimension is absolutely central. He says, I don't just simply understand this in psychological or even principally in psychological terms. So I think that's important to bear in mind. And I think that also relates to this exchange between Previn and Bill, insofar as I agree that for the working class does experience oppression, but I think the way that oppression is framed is really consequential, and that is the politics of the matter. And I think that you have right-wing authoritarian politics that seek to try to assign causation to to immigration, to deindustrialization, to anonymous forces of globalization, without addressing the fundamental social relations that constitute capitalism. And I think that is precisely the left's job, is to articulate those contradictions. So I think we do have a need to maintain categories of left and right, and indeed sharpen and clarify them. I think this is really key. For the question of renationalization, one thing that, I mean, it's too late now, but at some point it would be interesting to hear about the developments in Chile with the new constitution as really the kind of birthplace of authoritarian neoliberalism in 1973, and now some movement beyond that with Boric, the new constitution, which obviously there are huge limitations on what's possible. Is this in fact a break with it or not? But I think that would be also an interesting dimension of this discussion. The last thing I'd like to address is David's question, and in fact there's an answer to this in the Spectres of Fascism book given by Ajay Gudavarti, and his argument as to why you have these business elites who are really integrated into the global economy. Why are they supporting things like Hindutva? Well, one could argue that it is, in a sense, a particular analysis and response to the crisis of social cohesion that was a result of the very Modi model that has been put in place in India now for some time. But those reforms, those neoliberal reforms, go in fact back to the Congress Party and in the late 80s, early 90s. So I think that might be a way of understanding this kind of configuration. I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks very much.
Everyone, the book is available. Thank you to all three panelists.
Wow, tremendous presentations. I knew we were going to get a great discussion. Thanks so much, Ingar, Bill, and Samir. Fantastic. As good, if not better than your essays, I'll dare say. Because you kind of brought it up to the date in a very current discussion of where we're at, and really important presentations.
Our next presentation from this book is April 10th. It is on the global struggle of the working class with David Harvey, with speakers from Brazil and Russia will be here on Sunday, April 10th, 2 o'clock. All of you are welcome to be there. The book is available both with the MEP, Monthly Review, Merlin in the UK, Fernwood in Canada. Get your copy, read these articles. They're essential for us to organize. And thank you everyone for coming.
And out in India in the next few weeks, and being translated into Turkish too.
Ah,